The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Well, I'm happy to be here. I hope you're happy to be here too. I'd like to remind our audience that this is a live call-in show. Feel free to call in on the topic of the evening, 343-9927. 343-9927 to share your insights, questions, challenges, corrections, or whatever. And of course, our topic of the evening is the history of Spain. And of course, as always, my faithful co-host, Lang Baker, is here. Lang, good to see you.
Glad to be here, Wayne.
Glad to have you. And the reason I wanted to look into Spain's history is because I've been thinking off and on that they once dominated the world, and I thought, well, I wonder why they don't anymore. They're basically a non-entity, except when you hear about their troubles now, with economics and the rebellion in Catalonia. And I did read up on years ago on the Spanish Civil War and, of course, the Spanish-American Wars. So I thought, maybe there are some parallels between their decline and the decline of more modern empires, so to speak. Anyhow, one thing I'm learning in doing these shows, Lang, about the history of different parts of the world is it seems like it's always the same stuff, just a different part of the world. And it appears as though Spain was no different. I guess it's basically like everything else. They started out, like you mentioned earlier, cavemen and whatnot. Then Africans, from the African continent migrated up. And then we had I guess the general organization into different strongmen forming their fiefdoms or whatever, I guess, right? And then it eventually came up into several kingdoms, which then consolidated through marriages and conquest, right?
I would guess that's probably a rough description of the sequence there.
Okay.
It's kind of like the way people surround the planet, or they get tribes that get larger, and the larger they get, then often organized and have a warlord or a leader of some kind who decides to go conquer the nearby tribe or whatever.
Well, I read, actually, now I'm going to get sidelined here, but that's okay. I read where in Europe there was a problem, people basically, were just rural communities. They didn't have any strong power or whatever, and when they were out traveling on the roads to sell their wares or their produce, they would be robbed by highwaymen. And then some of the highwaymen got the idea that, hey, I'll tell all the people in this one region that I'll protect them from the other highwaymen if they'll pay me tribute. And that's where the idea of kingships or kingdoms came around, I guess, and kings. So, and I guess that's kind of what we're talking about here too on the Iberian Peninsula, which I learned with this was originally the region that became Spain, or at least the main part of Spain eventually, was the Iberian Peninsula. And then, of course, that's where New Iberia here in Louisiana got its name, as well as Iberia Parish, from the Spanish conquests. Anyway, I guess things for Spain really kicked off with Ferdinand and Isabella. Did you get some information on that?
Yeah, that was when they started consolidating the various kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula into a more or less single kingdom. Although I read one place that at first they were called the King of Spain's, plural, rather than the King of Spain.
Okay, yeah.
But then, Ferdinand was from Aragon, I believe. A region of Spain, or one of the kingdoms at the time.
He
Isabel was
inherited
from Castile,
and he inherited the kingdom of Aragon. So maybe he was from there, and his father had it, or whatever.
Yeah, and so those two, he was kind of the junior partner. Isabella was the first was the primary monarch in the more equal of the two equals.
Right. Well, she
And-
agreed. From what I understand, she agreed to share her monarchy with him, and then when he inherited Aragon or whatever, he shared that back with her. So they became a very powerful couple that I think were called the Catholic monarchs. weren't
They were named the Catholic monarchs by Pope Alexander VI, who himself was born on the Iberian Peninsula, and his family, the Borgias, were apparently a powerful family from what I read, and
They were a powerful crime family too. You had mentioned.
from one of the articles I read, yeah, he was involved in they gave a long list of various crimes, including murders, and
But his whole family, his family history was kind of like that, though, wasn't it?
that's what I understood from what I read.
Right, I realized,
And then,
you know,
then there was a battle between, off and on battle between his family and the Medicis of Italy, which were also linked to a variety of crimes through the decades or the
And-
centuries or however
but
long,
it-
and entanglements. Both families had several members who were popes at times, and both families were involved with the royal families of various countries in Europe. So
Okay, but, I'm wondering if that was like part of the transition from the highwaymen idea and the protection rackets, and that was where the crime still was involved in that. Of course, anywhere there's power, there's going to be crimes committed. They just may not be stated so in laws. But anyway, at this time with Isabella and Ferdinand and the Catholic monarch, so to speak, was this when after the Muslims had taken over or expanded into Europe, or was that?
they were in the Iberian Peninsula from early on, early 700s, I believe, and then they were gradually driven out in what was called the Reconquista, the Reconquista, which culminated in the late 1400s under Isabel and Ferdinand. They completed the expulsion of both of the Jews and the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. They could either convert or were kicked out or slaughtered or whatever.
Yes, and that was one of the new and interesting things I learned in getting ready for this show was the Jews were suspected of, because they were threatened with being killed if they did not convert to Christianity, a lot of them were accepting Christian baptism publicly to save their necks and still continuing to practice their Jewish religion in private. And the Spanish monarchs worried about the subversion that could occur of their power. And so that was the reason why the Spanish Inquisition was begun. The Pope granted Ferdinand permission to see a special branch of the Inquisition in Spain. And it began in 1480, I believe. The first Grand Inquisitor was appointed in 1480, and what they were doing was torturing suspected Jews to find out if they really were Jews or not, if they were real Christians or whatever. I guess if they survived the torture, they were considered Christians. But then you were saying that was expanded later on to everybody, right?
The Inquisition, from, as I recall, from not preparing for this program, but way back, reading various things about it, that the Inquisition lasted for decades or centuries. And
700
and
years.
was carried on in countries all throughout the Spanish Empire, and not just in Spain.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that they might have conducted the Inquisitions, and I know you're not sure of this, in the American colonies or possessions.
I recall reading something to that
Okay.
effect.
Yeah, and according to this history site that I found regarding it, it lasted until 1834, which was, I guess, when the decline of the Spanish Empire was already in progress, right?
Yeah, from what I was reading, the Spanish Empire started to go downhill in the late 1700s. Was not only were they combating the Muslims and the Jews, they were also combating the Protestants. They were like the vanguard of the Spanish or of the Catholic campaign against Protestants in Europe, and they were involved in the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War. The 80 Years' War was against the Dutch Protestants, and with the Dutch, it was a Spanish territory at that time, and the Dutch succeeded against them through, in fact, guerrilla warfare, and it depleted a lot of the economic resources of Spain in the 30 Years' War also. It was like they engaged in this war without end, you might say, that pretty much drove them close to bankruptcy, and that was one of the factors that led to the downfall of the empire. Was
and up until or when all that was going on, they were already a major and wealthy power in the world. In fact, they were the largest empire, most powerful empire of that time.
Yeah, Portugal was a separate country for a while, or a separate kingdom, and then it became part of the Spanish kingdom. I think that was in 1580, and it lasted for about 60 years. So during the time that they were combined as one kingdom, or empire, I should say, they were in geographic extent the largest world empire at that time.
Right, even though they ended up being significantly smaller than what the British Empire became. But the reason I wanted to bring that up is because it was I guess in the 15th century when their navies began going around the world and conquering. They conquered the Philippines, all of the Philippine Islands, all the Caribbean islands, and they colonized what became the North American Gulf Coast.
Yeah, I think probably in the 1600s.
Okay.
1500s, 1600s.
And of course, their biggest possessions were in Central and South America, where they slaughtered the Aztecs and Mayans, as I understand it, and of course carted off a whole bunch of their gold and silver.
Yeah, it was interesting. One thing I read about that was that the conquistadors were actually like privateers. They were licensed. They were doing this as a private enterprise, not as representatives of the crown so much, and that the Spanish crown received like 1/5 of the silver that was found there. And I don't know the exact ins and outs of this, but that's what one source said, was that the Spanish got a lot of silver because there was so much to be gotten, but they weren't getting 100% of the silver that was coming out of the Americas. And that actually during a significant period of this reign of the Habsburg house, which was, we can get into that if we want, but that was the royal family that was ruling for a couple of centuries in Spain, that the revenues for the operation of the peninsular Spain, the part in the Iberian Peninsula, the primary source of their income was taxes on the peasants.
The peasants in Spain, you're saying?
In Spain, yeah.
Okay, I read here that later on, as they established a fair amount of government control of their different possessions in the Americas and elsewhere, well, primarily in South and Central America, the gold and silver they mined from there came to Spain also. Now, are you saying those were still privateers? Or
well, one source I read said that they got 1/5 of that.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Well, that's probably still a lot of money for back in those days. But they were very wealthy, and so they probably felt they could afford to conduct all these wars against alien religions or heretics.
Yeah, and one thing I read was like the actually a lot of that influx of wealth from the Americas led to inflation and was spent by the aristocracy on buying luxury items, and it didn't actually contribute that much to the domestic economy.
Right, yeah, and I read that somewhere too, where corruption, because of all the power and the wealth, they became corrupted, and also they were trying to keep a closed economic system among all of Spain's possessions and colonies, but that got to be a problem, I guess partly because the monarchy and all their people were blowing so much of the money, but it got to where they couldn't provide enough goods to those possessions, and so European rivals, the Dutch, British, French, began making inroads both in the Caribbean areas and the Americas, as well as in Indonesia, the southern part of, the South China Sea and the like. And then, because of the corruption, the Spanish monarchy began participating in a lot of this illegal trade. And of course, as their money dwindled because of all their persecutions of the religious wars and whatnot, they couldn't afford to defend their possessions, and they began getting taken over by the European powers. Hence, the Dutch in Indonesia, and the Dutch. I know the Germans were trying to get control of Haiti and the Dominican Republic for a while. But anyway, that was where they started to head downhill. Anyway, let's see. We're discussing. This is Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought. We're discussing the history of the Spanish Empire, the history of Spain, and trying to show some parallels, maybe, if they exist, between the decline of that empire and the decline of other empires that are more modern in their characters. Anyway, 343-9927, 343-9927 is the number to call if you'd like to take part in the discussion, share your own insights, or whatever. Okay, so the Habsburgs, they were a later kingdom.
Well, they were a royal family in Europe. I think in Austria was one of the central areas, but they, through intermarriage and conquering other areas or whatnot, they got involved with Spain through marriage. Isabel's 5 kids, or the 5 that survived, were married off to royal families in various other countries, including a couple of them were married to Portuguese, a couple of them married to Habsburgs in Austria, and the youngest, Catherine, was married off to Henry VIII of England, his first wife, after having been his brother's wife first, but his brother died, and they went through a rigmarole with trying to get permission from the Pope and all this, and Henry VII died, and that's when Henry VIII decided, I'm going to go ahead and marry her anyway, and then she became mother to Mary, who became Mary the First, Queen of England for a while. So they had these ties to the various royal families around the continent, and that's where the Habsburgs, and I think 1700 was when the first Habsburg in Isabel's line became king of Spain. And no, that was not right. But anyway, they were the Habsburgs were the ruling family through the 16th and 17th centuries.
And that was where the majority of the problems, or the decline, began to accelerate, from what I understand.
Yeah, it lasted until 1700. That's when the last of the Habsburg died off without an heir, and so they brought in a cousin or something like that who was from the House of Bourbon, which was the ruling family in France. And so then we get the French connection. Right.
And speaking of France, there was also an invasion of Napoleon onto the Iberian Peninsula, or into the Spanish Empire, which also had a significant effect on the future of that empire.
Yeah, that was in 1808, after the French Revolution, when Napoleon rose to the top of French control and his imperial ambitions. And among those, he came in to take over Spain and appointed his brother to be the king of Spain, and that didn't go too well. The peasants rose up and executed guerrilla warfare against the French and defeated them.
Okay, against the French monarch that had taken charge of their throne. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I found it interesting when you mentioned the French Revolution, and which of course created the opportunity for Napoleon. But the French Revolution was largely the peasants who had been isolated economically by the political and economic elites. They rebelled and destroyed everything, basically.
Yeah, they overthrew the monarchy and the church, and that's what there were advocates for that same operation in Spain.
Yeah, it sounds like the same conditions: the ruling elite, royalty, and the dominance of the Catholic Church, and the political violence they both, caused and created. And the peasants finally said, "We're going to starve if we don't do something about this," and they rose up. So there's similarities there, as there are, I guess, throughout all history, like we've been discovering. But, so that was part of it. That significantly weakened the Spanish Empire, of course, which was already in decline.
Yeah, because then Spain was engaged in this battle at home, and so their American colonies
were becoming
started becoming economically independent and trading with the British and whatnot. And then after the Bonapartes were kicked out, or after Napoleon and his brother were kicked out, then the Spanish crown was restored and attempted to reassert their power in their colonies, which they succeeded for a brief period of time before the American South American and Central American and Mexico successfully gained their independence from Spain.
That's another thing, another parallel I've seen with another empire. There was that period where I guess the Spanish government had backed off, and for instance, the populations of the Philippines and Cuba began to feel a little more power, a little more control of their countries, and then the Spanish government tried to retake control after they got rid of Napoleon and everything else, and the people had had enough of a taste of their own sovereign power that they wouldn't have that. And that's kind of what happened to Vietnam too. I mean, it was a French possession, and when France pulled its troops out to fight against the Germans in World War II, the Vietnamese people took up the power with help from America, because we were fighting the Japanese in Vietnam at the time too. But once the Second World War was over and France tried to retake Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and the people in the North, the industrial North, weren't having any of that, and that's what prompted that revolt. And we know how that turned out. But in South America, eventually the Cubans revolted, as did in the Philippines. The people rebelled against Spain, and that's where it began to get interesting for the United States, I suppose.
Yeah, the Spanish-American War came along at the end of the 19th century, and then Napoleon was thrown out at the beginning of the 19th century. So the rest of the Latin American colonies of Spain gained their independence in the early 1800s, but Cuba and the Philippines, and the Spanish-American War, that came at the end of the rules of the period between the two republics in Spain, when the restored Habsburgian line that came to power after Napoleon was kicked out, when they faded again in the late 1800s.
Right, the late 1800s. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know where I was thinking there, but so when did you say that Napoleon was kicked out, or his
in
brother?
The early 1800s?
Okay, yeah. So that's what I'm thinking. That's
so there was about 75 years or 60 years or something like that in between when the monarchy was attempting to rule again, and there was all kinds of conflicts between the various factions within Spain. The Republicans and the progressives and the anti-clericals on one side, and then your wanting the authoritarian monarchy, and the church wanting to maintain its power on the other side. And these factions were combating against each other throughout that period between the removal of Napoleon and restoration of the monarchy in Spain, and in the early 1800s, and when the monarchy collapsed around the time of the Spanish-American War. Right,
and I guess that's what I was saying. During that time, the Spanish government was so preoccupied with its own problems, and at the same time trying to reestablish control over its possessions, that the populations of those possessions began revolting in the more remote areas, such as Cuba and the Philippines. And eventually, with the Cuban War, of course, American companies had a lot of investment in land and sugarcane in Cuba, and the peasants were revolting against the ruling class, the Spaniards there, and attacking their property, and they wanted to redistribute that, and that gave America an interest in that conflict. And from what I remember learning about yellow journalism back in the day, Randolph Hearst and John Pulitzer, I think was the guy, used their newspapers to inflame American passions into a humanitarian fervor for those poor Cubans who needed our help to fight off those evil Spaniards. And so we sent our Navy and Marines down there. Well, I guess we sent the Navy there first to try to keep things stable on the seafront, so that, in the seas, so that we could protect our trade. But then the Maine blew up, and they fanned that with, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain was the big slogan, kind of like weapons of mass destruction with Saddam Hussein, and in a more recent Imperial, thank you. Empirical is another word, but that's just me trying to pull up impressive words. Anyhow, but yeah, so we got involved in that war there and ended up co-opting both the Cuban Revolution and the Philippines Revolution. Well, in fact, we didn't really co-opt the Philippine Revolution. That's one of the new things I learned for tonight, too. we did that with Cuba, and we installed. I think was it the Batiste regime then, or did they come later?
They came later, I believe,
Okay.
because they were in power when Castro's revolution took place.
Right. But it was our co-opting of their first revolution in Cuba that ended up leading to Castro's revolution later on, because we established the power that we wanted in Cuba and supported them. And in the Philippines, it was China and Japan that wanted America to retain control of the Philippines because the European powers were making inroads into China, and they were afraid of them more than they were afraid of us, even though we'd already been there and were established there also. But so they wanted us to take control of the Philippines, and that's what we fought 3.5 years of a war with the Philippines for, was because the Marines, the Philippine Army or Marines, wanted to be independent, and they thought we were helping them. And then when Spain capitulated, they found out we weren't planning on leaving, which is another parallel, I guess, with a recent empire.
Yep.
Okay, well, anyway, then things moved on from there. We went through World War One, and did Spain stay out of World War One, or was it World War Two? I know they avoided one of the wars.
Yeah, I think they stay out of both of them.
Okay.
But,
Nevertheless, well, you got that there? We only got a few minutes, though.
Yeah, well, go ahead without me then.
Okay, well, we talked earlier about how the monarchies and all, had dominated, and the Catholic Church had predominated in Spain and controlled the land, and apparently that problem persisted or redeveloped later on, because then there was the Spanish Civil War, which was the lead up to, I guess, the Second World War. It was the first battle against fascism, I guess, in Europe, or that was recognized in the world. But there was a revolution against the Spanish situation that was considered a moderate left-wing type popular government that was trying to redistribute the land and whatnot into a more equitable manner. And Franco and the more conservative factions rebelled. The military rebelled against that. And so Spain fought a civil war, which was very bloody. And George Orwell and several other celebrities were involved in the war. In fact, George Orwell wrote a book, Homage to Catalonia, which was based on his experience there in the Spanish Civil War. And his service there ended when he was shot in the neck by a sniper and severely wounded. But of course, he survived to go on to write other books. But yeah, it was a war where Britain didn't get involved, but I think Germany and Russia got involved in the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, Germany and the Italians were fighting in support of Franco. The
Right.
German Air Force inflicted severe damage on town Guernica in the Basque region. That
Right.
was then, within a few months, Pablo Picasso did a giant painting in homage to that atrocity that garnered a lot of it toured. It was first shown in Paris and sent to other cities, and did a lot to support the Republican cause and raise global awareness of the Spanish Civil War, what was going on down there. But then the Italians sent thousands of troops in to help as well. And then the Soviets gave some support to the Republican side, the anti-fascist side. But the British
right.
and Americans stayed out of it. And
Right, because the government at the time was basically made up of peasants, or it was their cause, the peasants' cause, and it was the moneyed classes in Russia's view, I guess, at the time. It was their cause to promote that, and that's why they would. By the same token, both Germany was under Hitler at the time, and Italy was under Mussolini, both of whom were allies with each other, and both fascists. So they had an interest in preserving things in Spain as also. But yeah, let's see. We've got about 13 seconds, Lang. But well, I don't think we got to everything, as we often don't. But in any case, that's why Spain was once an empire and declined and went away to sum things up. And so There were lessons to be learned with corruption, expanding your empire too far, being too brutal, and spending all of your nation's wealth on wars
Right.
that we could think about for today in modern America.
Big part of Spanish decline was
Well,
exhausting their treasury, waging wars against the Dutch and the Protestants all over Europe.
yeah, and like the Roman Empire and like many other empires in the past and future.
And then there was the great factions that were battling against one another within Spain.
Yeah, and we discussed that earlier, but we can't get to that now. Anyway, you've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We've been discussing the history of Spain and trying to draw some thin parallels between their decline and that of others. Anyway, we got to go. You have a good evening.
By Louis Cafe, located at 3322 Lake Street in Baton Rouge, still in the shadow of LSU's Campanile. Louis Cafe serves breakfast, lunch, and dinner